Cool. All right, morning everyone. I realize it's sort of early, 9:10, so thanks to everyone for having caffeinated up and being ready. My name's Seth Priebatsch. I'm the chief ninja of LevelUp. That's sort of like CEO, but tries to be a little bit more interesting. I'll give some quick background on myself, and then talk a bit about this idea of interchange zero, which is basically the theory that the cost of moving money, the cost of payment processing, is going to pretty rapidly over the next couple of years trend to zero, and that the only way that payment processors and that businesses are going to have to pay for the right to move money is going to be about how to leverage the data within each of those transactions. So basically a giant shift from the traditional business model of payment processing to one that's based on data and based on being able to drive action out of those insights, which should be huge for local businesses, should be huge for SMBs, and hopefully by the end of the next 20 or 30 minutes, I'll convince you that not only can money flow as frictionlessly as data, but that there can actually be a much bigger business for local businesses and for the payments ecosystem all around that. And just for good fun, mobile plays into it a little bit as well. So I want to give some quick background on myself, because at 9:10 in the morning, for someone wearing probably a little bit too much orange to jump up on stage and say, hey, a $50 billion industry that's been around for almost 100 years is going to disappear, is perhaps a little bit unbelievable. I do like the Alice in Wonderland mantra of trying to believe 7 impossible things before breakfast, so we're at least before breakfast. But I'm going to try and justify a little bit of my background and then talk about how this idea of the cost of moving money disappearing and being replaced with an information-based model could actually happen, and potentially happen in really a pretty short span of time considering. So very quick background on myself. I'm a proud Princeton dropout. I attended for 2 semesters. That's the minimum amount of time that they let you go before, before they'll call you a dropout. If you only go for 1 semester, they actually pretend you never came. If you go for 3, they try not to let you leave. But 1 year, they'll let you drop out. So won the Princeton Business Plan competition there, dropped out, founded a company called Scavenger. And actually, LevelUp is the second product from this company, Scavenger. And part of the reason why I bring Scavenger up is that it's sort of one of the interesting components of where this idea of an information-based model came from, because it didn't really work, right? To be totally honest, Scavenger grew very, very quickly. I don't know if any of you followed the story. Grew to be worth about $100 million over 9 months, and it was sort of a competitor to Foursquare, and tried to build on this sort of location-based services model to provide engagement, to provide a richer version of the check-in, the challenge, but it never connected to payments. It never actually was able to prove any of the revenue, any of the power that it could drive to local businesses. And so, after about a year, we ended up launching what was, at the time, the largest location-based campaign of all time with a group of Buffalo Wild Wings. They've got about 700 locations all across the country. Over 8 weeks, Scavenger drove 180,000 players, unlocked 500,000 rewards, 1.2 million challenges, 17 million social impressions, ended up winning this awesome award for 2011. And at the end of the day, we went to the Buffalo Wild Wings agency and said, look at all this great social data we've provided. 17 million social impressions, that's got to be awesome. And they said, yup, that's awesome. Did you know that in that time you also drove us several $1 million of marginal revenue? Here's your check for 25K. Let's do this again next quarter. And we sort of, as a company, looked at one another and said, hey, this is awesome. Clearly the product works, and also this is terrible. Like, clearly we've dropped the ball on the most interesting part of what one can actually do with location and with mobile and with all of this data, which is tie it to the transaction and actually prove the value inherent in being able to move people around, being able to drive behavior, and being able to actually drive transactions. And that's sort of the fundamental basis of why I think everyone's so excited about mobile. So in true startup fashion, we pivoted super hard. This is the last little bit I'll talk about LevelUp and then dive into sort of the macroeconomic theories of why we pivoted and why we think this is interesting. But for 2 more minutes of background so that the rest of the story makes sense, LevelUp is the second product from the company Scavenger. It's now the main focus. It's all we do. It's a way to pay with your phone at about 5,000 different merchants. We've got about 1.5 million users. We've raised about $50 million so far from Google, Deutsche Telekom, founders of Discover Card. And the core background of it is based on this idea that the interesting part of payments, the interesting part of all of this mobile data, is being able to use the information in those transactions to drive customer behavior, to bring in new customers, to bring them back, to drive traffic when it's raining, and not to make money off of moving money. LevelUp does 2 things. It processes payments, and it provides this campaign behavior. We process payments at break even. It's 2% for us. It was 2.5% a year ago. It'll be 1.5% in a year, as some macroeconomic factors drive the cost of moving money down. I'll talk about that in a second. Where we make money is off campaigns. and you're seeing more and more companies making money off of leveraging data, not just off moving money back and forth. So enough on LevelUp. Now what I want to talk about is basically the giant macroeconomic theory of interchange zero that's actually driving this new type of business model. So to rewind back to the beginning, interchange zero is this idea that the cost of moving money is eventually going to go away. That right now the 2, 3, 4, 5% that people pay to move a dollar back and forth from a customer's bank account to a merchant's bank account will eventually be zero. And the reason that this is happening is sort of a mashup of two mega trends, one being gaming and the other being mobile. Gaming is providing the ability to use this data and to leverage game mechanics in the real world to drive behavior, to drive revenue for merchants, and mobile providing the tools to actually move that cost of moving money lower and lower over time, so eventually, just like moving data across the internet, it's a little bit too cheap to meter. So let's start with gaming. As you can probably tell just by everything about me, I'm a little bit of a geek. I play a lot of video games. I really enjoy them. So do lots of other people. 125 years worth of Angry Birds are played every day. Not sure that's a great trend, but it's definitely true, and a lot of things are going, a lot of time is being spent there. The average gamer is 35 years old. It's not, a young teenager eating Cheetos in their parents' basement. It's actually a 35-year-old person eating Cheetos in their parents' basement. So it's a pretty persistent trend. Gaming is very social. 50% of games are played with a Facebook login. It's also tapping into the next generation hugely. 75% of teens play games, but also so do heads of household. So gaming, big trend. Not going to spend too much justifying this. Later on in the presentation, I'm going to go into why gaming is interesting as it pertains to payments and local businesses, because those same mechanics that make games so compelling are what's being used to leverage the data in payments to increase revenue. And that's sort of the new business model for payments. So talk about that in a second. Major trend 2, mobile. I'm going to blast through this slide because by virtue of you guys being here, you're probably already with me that mobile is a bit more than a fad at this point. The one fun thing about this slide is that this slide is actually from 2011. Not this specific slide, but all the data on this slide. All of the numbers are now twice as big. So basically mobile is not just a trend, it is the trend. Everyone is sort of starting to come around to this. Anything that isn't mobile probably isn't going to be super relevant in the next couple of years. So what mobile has to do with payments is that it's providing the framework to drive the cost of moving money down, thus opening up the ability for game mechanics to take over and drive revenue up. So let's go back to how that actually ties into interchange zero. Whoops, a little bit too fast. One more. Animations. Next. OK, cool. So there are 3 parts to this. Just some definition stuff for those of you who might not be as into the payment space as I am. Interchange is basically what it costs to move money back and forth. When you see Square or Flint or anyone else saying it's 2% to charge money, 3% to charge money, 2% plus 20-cent swipe fees, that's basically interchange. For merchants, it adds up to about 2 to 20% of total volume, so it's a pretty expensive cost. Lower ticket prices have higher interchange because that swipe fee is a bigger component. And all in all, it's $50 billion a year that merchants pay in payment processing fees. We say merchants pay this in payment processing fees, but in reality, it's consumers, right? The merchants have to pay it, so the prices are slightly higher. So at the end of the day, interchange is really coming out of all of our pockets. So it's a big expense. It's a big problem. Some quick examples on exactly how expensive it is, and I'll just let you guys sort of look through these. But essentially, on a $1.50 transaction, your interchange might be as high as 20%. So if you're buying a pack of gum, please pay cash. Local businesses will appreciate it. On a $25 transaction, it's only about 4.5% on average because you're amortizing that swipe fee across a bigger and bigger transaction. So long story short, interchange is super expensive. And wouldn't it be nice if instead of having to pay that $50 billion a year and having that sort of sucked out of the local economy, if you didn't have to, if it were just zero? It would be a $50 billion injection into the local economy, and I think everyone would be pretty excited about that. But as we all know, pulling $50 billion out of an ecosystem, especially at 9:15 in the morning, is no easy task. So the question sort of becomes, how does one actually get there? And the good news is it's only 2 steps to make interchange zero a reality. The bad news is those 2 steps are pretty difficult, but at least there's only 2 of them. The first is that the cost has to go down, and this is really the job of mobile. Mobile is enabling the cost of moving money to drop pretty dramatically, and thus freeing up the opportunity to collect more data and use that data more wisely. And the second is that revenue has to go up, that there has to be a way to take that data for local businesses to actually act on it, to use the same big data analytics tools that Amazon and Walmart are using, but on a local level to drive revenue up. And in the remaining sort of 15 minutes, I'm going to try and talk through exactly how these two things are going to happen. So the first is driving costs down. And a bit of quick history on interchange is, what direction have costs been going? If costs have been going down for the last 60 years, driving them down to zero shouldn't be so hard. But the truth is costs have been going up for the last 60 years. Interchange rates have generally gone in only one direction. That direction is up, and it tends to move fast. But it's just started moving down again. And the question is why? Why has this sort of 60-year, seemingly unarrestable trend in interchange going up changed? And the reason is basically mobile technology, that there are now many, many more ways for people to pay that are driving costs down. Square is probably actually the best example of this. They sort of simplified and flattened the payments ecosystem and made the base price that everyone thinks about 2.75%, which is actually dramatically lower than what many of the credit card processors had been offering previously. So if mobile is such a big component of this, if it's going to have a big impact, the question is sort of why is it having that impact? And what people generally think about when they talk about mobile payments is they say, well, mobile payments is the future because I'm going to be able to pay with my phone, right? And that's super cool. I saw it in a movie once. I hear it's big in Japan. Like, it's going to be amazing. We're all just going to be leaving our wallets at home and paying with our phones. But that's actually not the really key important shift regarding mobile payments. It's not necessarily paying with your phone. It's that you have more ways to pay with your phone. The phone happens to be the medium. It's just an infinitely sized wallet, right? A wallet is restricted by how many plastic cards you can fit into it before you get sort of a Costanza-esque wallet explosion. Mobile technology has no problem like that. And so you can get lots and lots of different payment methods in, and that increases competition, and that's driving costs down. If you think about the old world for what payments looked like for a local business, they basically had 5 options, right? Cash, MasterCard, Visa, Discover, and American Express. And those latter 4 are pretty much the same, right? The difference between MasterCard and Visa, it's really hard to tell, right? There are modest differences, but it's generally the same thing. This led to not that much competition, enabled costs to rise. In the new world, sort of the brave new world, what happens is the consumer opens their wallet, and suddenly they're presented with a plethora of payment options, and the merchant has the ability now, thanks to Durbin legislation, to actually incentivize those payment options differently. So maybe their mobile wallet is linked to their MasterCard or Visa or American Express or Discover card, but maybe it's linked to their carrier bill, and the money's coming off Verizon. Maybe it's linked to PayPal. Maybe it's linked directly to their bank account. Maybe it's linked to Bitcoin. Probably not Bitcoin, but could be. Can be linked to pretty much anything and opens up a tremendous amount of competition, and that's sort of one of the key drivers of how mobile technology is able to, essentially increase competition. We all know from Econ 101, and again, I dropped out of Princeton, so I have to leverage Econ 101 because I didn't get too much further, that more competition means lower costs, and overall, that's a good thing. It's not just technology, though. It's also being aided by government. And this is actually one of the areas for all the crap that our government gets that they actually have done, to date, a reasonably good job in fostering competition in the payment space. This is a guy, Dick Durbin. He's a senator from Illinois. And Durbin legislation basically broke the backs of the debit card monopoly. That MasterCard and Visa pretty much owned 100% of the debit card transactions. They colluded a little bit, and the costs were exceptionally high. Durbin legislation has dropped those costs pretty dramatically, shifting most of the cost into the swipe fee. And I'm going to do a little bit of a math warning that here it's about to get a little mathy for early in the morning, but it's fun. When you look at the way a debit card works, the vast majority of the cost is in the swipe fee. You pay 30 cents a swipe and then 0.05% of the total volume of the transaction. So pretty much all of it is in that swipe. The difference between a $1 transaction and a $100 transaction is pretty small. Didn't used to be like that. Credit cards are not like that. The costs are much more on the percentage. So what this has enabled companies to do is innovate in some pretty interesting ways to drive transactions down. There are 2 companies out there and a bunch more doing this method of interchange compression called bundling. How many of you guys have bought a song from iTunes, for example? I assume a lot? Cool, a lot. When you buy a song from iTunes, what you'll notice is that your transaction isn't actually charged immediately. that because it's a 99-cent song, and they don't want to pay a 30-cent swipe fee on a 99-cent song, they wait 5 days, 6 days, 7 days to see if you buy another app, another power-up in Angry Birds, another anything, and group those transactions together. A lot of other companies are starting to do this to basically cache and reduce interchange. LevelUp actually employs a similar algorithm, and I can share some data from this to show how mobile technology is sort of aiding in that first part of interchange zero, driving the cost down. This is an average user on the LevelUp platform. They use it about 4 times a week. And if we were to charge the transactions individually, as a local business would have to, we'd end up paying that 30-cent swipe fee and some variable fee each time, resulting in $30 of spend and about $1.50 in interchange. Pretty expensive. However, once you implement bundling and you group these transactions together, much like Apple does with iTunes, there's nothing really special about this math. It's just you're only paying that swipe fee once, 30 cents, still paying the same variable fee, but you end up with a massive reduction in interchange, about 61%. This is a system that LevelUp has implemented. This is a system that lots of other mobile companies are implementing, and it's driving the cost of interchange down incrementally, but bit by bit, and more over time. Really important component to basically, achieving the first step of interchange zero, which is leveraging competition and legislation to, drive the number of options up, drive the effective interchange down, and lower costs bit by bit, so that you can get rid of that $50 billion a year and start focusing on the really interesting and exciting part, which is what is the data in those payments and how are we going to leverage them to drive revenue up, help local businesses succeed, and build a new model around payments that doesn't rely on taking a tax off the top each time a dollar goes through. So that's step 1, interchange going down. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we're making good progress in solving a $50 billion problem early in the morning. Step 2 is the really fun one, and that's bringing revenue up, leveraging data, and helping local businesses actually act on that data in interesting ways. So if you're going to get rid of the idea of making money off of payments by taking 2, 3, 4% off of each payment, you'd better be willing to replace that, or better be able to replace that with something at least as big, if not bigger. I think a lot of us here can probably agree that the most fascinating part of a payment isn't actually that a dollar moves back and forth. I think we could achieve that with paper bills. It's that there's now some really rich account-based data of who's paying, what they're buying, how often they're spending, what their transactional habits are. And when you start to take that data and mash it together with game mechanics, remember this first mega trend of gaming, you can start to motivate behavior in some really interesting ways, help SMBs actually leverage that data to drive new behavior, and basically give them the big data and the big analytics and the big motivation tools that Amazon's been doing successfully for a decade and a half, but now in the real world. So I want to walk through 3 examples of that to make it concrete. There are 3 game mechanics very specifically engineered to drive behavior out of a transactional ecosystem. We'll talk about the sunken reward, the progression dynamic, and the appointment dynamic. The sunken reward is a pretty fun one. If any of you guys are hardcore gamers, you've probably seen this before. But it's basically a reward that is sunken at a place, is something you don't have to do any work to get. It just exists elsewhere, and once you make it to that location, you get the reward. So it's sort of used to motivate discovery of new places. If you play World of Warcraft, and if you do, you should probably stop, and if you don't, you should probably start. But if you play World of Warcraft, you'll know that there are rewards sort of when you discover new areas of the game to get people to explore more often. But sunken reward is not just used for World of Warcraft. It's also used in the real world to drive transactions in some really interesting ways. There's this great company called ScoutMob that basically built a model that leverages the sunken reward game mechanic to get people to discover new local merchants. That they said, hey, we're going to place these rewards that you don't have to buy, that are just geolocated to a business, because we know that the important part of discovering a business isn't a Groupon-esque 10 for $20, it's actually getting you to the physical location. Once you're at that new place, the natural mechanics of that area take over. If I'm at a new area in World of Warcraft, I'm going to explore and do missions. If I'm at a new cafe, I'm going to sit down and grab a coffee. So we worked with them and actually did some simulations of this within the LevelUp ecosystem to collect some data. And basically compared and contrasted the game mechanics in a Groupon, in a daily deal, with those in a sunken reward based off of some data we were able to get from both parties and some tests we ran with our own 5,000 merchants. On a daily deal, the spend value of the customer ends up being about 1.25 times the deal value. The reason this happens is a daily deal has all sorts of negative mechanics. It's got a really dangerous mechanic called thresholding, where if I've spent $10 to get $20, the game is spend as close to $20 as I possibly can. Right? If I spend $21, I've lost because I spent an extra dollar. If I spend $19, I've lost because I left $1 on the table. So I'm really going to screw the merchant out of as much margin as possible because that's the game. In a sunken reward, that mechanic doesn't exist. Right? The reward is already there. The natural mechanics of the business take over. And what we found was that there's a 4.7x ratio from the spend of the customer to the deal value. That's partially because customers spent more. That's partially because the deals didn't need to be as rich in order to motivate the behavior. So slightly different game mechanic, much better results, great example of using game mechanics and data to create new revenue in an area where it hadn't existed before. Having gone through just sort of a technical one, we're going to jump to one that everyone will recognize. This is the progression dynamic. It's a game dynamic in which progress is granularly displayed to move people along a given path. This is my favorite example of this one is again World of Warcraft. You sort of level up from Paladin to level 1 to 85. If any of you have logged into LinkedIn recently, which I'm guessing many of you have, you'll probably see that little green progress bar up in the top right that tells you basically how complete of a human you are. And I've never been able to get past 85%. If anyone wants to recommend me, please do. LinkedIn will finally complete my progress bar, and I will be filled with complete existential joy. But it's a very powerful mechanic to get people to do the same thing again and again and to sort of follow along a pre-described path. So you can probably guess how this plays out in the real world, in the transactional world. The progression mechanic in the real world is basically a loyalty program, is a punch card. It's motivating people to go along a specific path again and again to fill up a progress bar. And there are tons of companies that do this, right? There's Perkville, there's Perk Street, there's Perka. I think there's even one called Percocet these days. They're all sort of got Perk in the name for whatever reason. And they basically drive consumers to go to a place to purchase a coffee, to spend money, to follow that progression dynamic, and institute that same sort of rigorous habitual behavior. Again, because what I find fun in putting together any presentation like this is being able to actually use the data set we've got within LevelUp to back up some of the claims we're seeing around game mechanics. And so we worked with a number of these companies that were accepting LevelUp payments and running their own loyalty programs, some of them that were running loyalty programs on LevelUp, and basically said, can we aggregate your data and look at the impact of the introduction of a loyalty program? So we took about 50 businesses that didn't have a loyalty program. They introduced a whole variety of different loyalty programs. So it was some were visit-based, some were spend-based, really all over the place. And this is what the data looked like. The dark blue line is repeat customers. The orange line is new customers. And what you see is two pretty interesting trends. The repeat customer line goes up pretty dramatically, as you would expect. A loyalty program institutes, a progression mechanic institutes a behavior to get people to do the same thing again and again. That same thing in this case is visiting the business and placing an order. But also, it has almost zero impact on the generation of new customers, which makes sense. Right? It's a mechanic that is very isolated to driving repeat behavior, to driving the same person to do the same thing again and again. But what's cool about this for us is that even in the very messy world of transactions, game mechanics can be isolated. There's very little leakage, right? One game mechanic has one impact and doesn't necessarily impact other parts of the ecosystem. So that's sort of the core lesson to take away from the progression dynamic and a cool thing. And we'll talk about one last one and then hopefully tie it all together and be able to send you on for the rest of the day. The last dynamic I want to talk about is the appointment dynamic. This is a dynamic in which to succeed, a player must take a specific action at a pre-described time. So it's not just that I want you to do a thing, it's not just that I want you to do it again and again, it's that I want you to do it at 10:30 a.m. or at some very, very specific time. The best example of this in the real world is the Tamagotchi. I hope people remember this. The Tamagotchi was one of a really fun toy. I didn't have one in hot pink. I think I had an orange one for good reason. But basically, the Tamagotchi had a game mechanic in it where if you didn't pay attention to it every couple of hours, if you didn't feed it, if you didn't clean up after it, if you didn't take it for a walk, it would die, and you'd be very upset for the rest of the day. So it was a very effective, very early implementation of the appointment dynamic. The more modern version of this is Farmville. So if any of you played Farmville, and it's sort of waned in the past couple of I guess months, year, but at its peak, it had 100 million monthly active users, and they had a mechanic where you had to go back every 12 hours to harvest your crops. And if you didn't, your crops would overgrow, or they'd die, or something bad would happen. And the brilliant minds at Zynga, the makers of Farmville, when they needed to make their numbers for the end of a quarter, knew that the appointment dynamic was so powerful that they could juice user behavior just by shrinking the window. So they said, we've got people visiting our site or our game on Facebook every 12 hours. Let's make it so that it's every 6 hours. And if you don't go back every 6 hours, your crops will die. And lo and behold, people started coming back every 6 hours. And then they said, okay, we'll do it every 3 hours. And lo and behold, people came back every 3 hours. And they got it down to about 90 minutes. This coincided with the sort of economic recession of like 2008, 2009. So I think it caused some real problems macroeconomically. And eventually at 90 minutes, people started to fall apart. But they could actually get it down to build really regular behavior at very specific times, leveraging essentially one game mechanic, the appointment dynamic. So how does this play into the real world? Well, there's an awesome company called ThinkNear, which just recently got purchased by Telenav. And they basically use the appointment dynamic to drive revenue for businesses at very specific times, right? They look at a business's patterns and they know, okay, there's going to be traffic this morning, so they're going to be slow. There's an event tonight, so they're going to be super busy. It's raining outside, so they're going to be slow. And they can basically construct mechanics to bring people in around those appointments. Super powerful, super interesting. Again, we look to the LevelUp ecosystem to track some data around this. And this is maybe my favorite slide in the entire deck. I can prove that restaurateurs in Philadelphia absolutely hate the rain, and for good reason. If you look at this slide, the green line is a normalized sort of transaction count, how many orders a business is seeing in a given day, and the orange line is rain. So you can see there's a pretty clear inverse correlation. The more rain, the lower transactions. But the hidden thing in this graph is that while transactions drop when it starts raining, the average ticket price goes up. So transactions drop by about 20%, but the average ticket price goes up by about 10% because people spend longer in the store, they bring a coffee back for their colleagues. So if you can get people in, it's actually much more profitable. And companies like ThinkNear and a number of other ones out there are helping SMBs crunch this data and actually drive people in at those specific times to create more profitable transactions, again, leveraging this sort of very specific game mechanic of the appointment dynamic. So when we sort of talk about this new monetization model for payments and why it's going to be exciting for local businesses, there are really two components. One is interchange going down, and that no longer being the monetization model. And the second is using game mechanics and data to drive revenue, and that sort of being the way in which processors earn the right to process the money for a local business. And if you map these two trends together, you basically have a two-step way to pull a $50 billion cost out of the economy. You're already starting to see it happen. Costs are going down. The cost of moving money has dropped about 30% in the last 3 years. I believe it's going to drop over time to be closer and closer to zero. And you see more and more companies realizing that the real value in payments isn't that small margin on moving each dollar back and forth, but is the incredible wealth of data that's in it, and providing the tools to help SMBs and eventually bigger businesses leverage that data to drive more revenue, and their monetization exists off of that. So that's all I've got to say. It's sort of the theory of interchange zero, and thank you guys for listening this early in the morning, and yeah, have a fantastic rest of the day.